first of all, thank you all for joining today. And I would love to introduce today's presentation and presenter, and that is Professor Stanley Mirvis, who currently is an assistant professor of history in the School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies at ASU. And he is the Harold Jean Grossman Chair of Jewish Studies at Arizona State University. So today we have him presenting actually on a subject that he has written a book about that we'll share later, an opportunity for you to use a discount code if you would like to purchase it through Yale Press. But the title of the book is The Jews of 18th-Century Jamaica, which is a testamentary history of a diaspora in transition. I think it really is a subject that kind of connects to Monday's presentation, which was from the International Folk Art Market. So I'm going to share the floor with Professor Mirvis, and thank you very much for your time today and your presentation. And again, if you do have questions, anyone that is following this, if you do have questions, please do feel free to put them in the chat, or there will be opportunities for questions and answers after the formal part of the presentation. So thank you.
Okay, hello, there we go. I'm just trying to get a PowerPoint. I don't often use PowerPoints in this kind of presentation, but I figured it would be nice to see some images. Does that look good to you?
Yeah, it's perfect.
Great, okay. Thank you very much, Levi, for inviting me to participate in this program. I'm really happy to be here and to share with you some of the work I have been doing over the past decade on the Portuguese Jewish diaspora, and specifically talking about Jamaica. So the book is called The Jews of 18th Century Jamaica, a Testamentary History of a Diaspora in Transition. And it's called a testamentary history because it's chiefly focused on the primary sources at the heart of the book are last wills and testaments. So it's as much about studying wills as it is about studying the specific community of Jamaica. But I figured for today, I'd leave the will part out, but I'm happy to talk about it in the discussion. And just today, rather, give a overview of how did Jews get to Jamaica, and also the way that I've periodized the 18th century a little bit, and the different major moments that affected Jews living in 18th century Jamaica. So that's my plan for today, and I'll speak for about 40 minutes, and then we can, we'll feel free to have a discussion. Here we're going to see a modern map, which I might have to come back to. But just while we're here, I wanted to point your attention to the southeast coast of the island of Jamaica. So up here is Cuba. Over here to the east is Hispaniola, which is modern day Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And so just south of Cuba is the island of Jamaica. And here you see a kind of merchant capital of Jamaica, that's Kingston. And here, along this sand tumbelow that goes through the Kingston Harbor is the city of Port Royal, which was the major mercantile capital of the late 17th century, which we'll talk about in great detail in a minute. And then over further to the west is Spanish Town, the political capital of Jamaica in the 18th century, but not today. So really, I'll just be talking about this area here when I refer to Kingston, Port Royal, and Spanish Town. Though there were Jewish settlements in Lucy and then Montego Bay and Savlamar and Black River, but I'm going to leave those off of it for now. Okay, here's you see an 18th century map of Jamaica. Okay, but before we even get to Jamaica, you have to understand who were the Jews that settled there, why, and how did they define their own identity. So I want to briefly, we could spend hours talking about this topic, but just briefly talk about what we mean by a Portuguese diaspora. Now, this is kind of distinct from the Sephardi diaspora, but it's part of a Sephardic diaspora. Sephardi is kind of a difficult term to apply to Portuguese. And that's the Portuguese Jews. That's because they never call themselves that. They never used the terminology Sephardim or called themselves Sephardi Tahor, like a pure Sephardi, like you see in the Ottoman Mediterranean. But they were definitely connected to the circumstances of expulsion in the late 15th century. But one thing that makes this community of Jews very distinct from Sephardim in the Ottoman world, those that were expelled from Spain in 1492 in southern Italy in 1492, is that they had all been Catholics at one point. Everybody who's a Portuguese Jew had the experience in their ancestry of having been conversos, some, that is, Catholics with Jewish ancestry. The vast majority of conversos in Spain especially were committed Catholics. And then, but Portugal was a little different. In Portugal, because of the circumstances of the expulsion, which was really just a mass conversion of the stalwart Jews that had left from Spain in 1492, you have the conditions by which real crypto-Judaism, or what the Spanish referred to derogatorily as Marianism, to refer to like pig eating, because that's exactly what real crypto Jews don't do. They won't eat pig if you give it to them. But in Portugal, in the 16th century, you have actual crypto Judaism because of these unique circumstances, which we can refer back to again. So by the 16th century, there's almost no crypto Judaism in Spain itself. And everything changes in 1580 when the Spanish crown under Philip II annexed Portugal and also all of its overseas territory. And in doing that, they erased the borders between Portugal and Spain, which allowed real crypto Jews to enter into Spain and there have this influence over conversos who had forgotten a Jewish ancestry or conversos who were committed Catholics. And then as an irony of history, from Spain, they were able to cross the border into southern France, where Jews have been expelled over the course of the 14th century. There have been multiple expulsions from France that culminated in 1394. So Jews were technically not allowed to live in France, but that's the great irony, is that they entered France not as Jews, but as Catholics, as Portuguese merchants. And in that way, were able to settle there. I'll show you some maps in a second. So this is really the community of Bayonne or San Jean de Luz, so these kind of Pyrenees border towns, where you start to see the incubation of a return to Judaism, or in some cases, the adoption of rabbinic Judaism, a movement that's referred to broadly as re-Judaization, the process of transitioning from being a converso to being into rabbinic Judaism. And this was happening in southern France. This is very important in the story of Jamaica, because we'll see that the Jews that first populate Jamaica are from southern France, mostly. They are from Bayonne. The leadership of that community are conversos that had left Iberia to settle in France. And it's there where they really began the process of embracing or encountering rabbinic Judaism. In southern France, there were missionaries. Emmanuel Abouab writes a very famous series of letters where he's missionizing these kind of, sometimes they're referred to as Judeo-conversos, because they're in sort of a liminal space in France, because they're not able to live there legally as Jews, but they do anyway. And the French sort of turn a blind eye. But already in the 16th century, you've got Hebrew tombstones. There are missionaries, Jewish missionaries, that are coming to try to familiarize these Jews with what rabbinic Judaism looks like. And they also, there are mohelim there to offer a circumcision, mostly to adults, right? Conversos that are returning in southern France, and they require circumcision. Very few actually want to be circumcised, and that becomes a problem, as we'll see. And so this is the formation of what we call a Western Sephardi diaspora or a Portuguese diaspora. Again, I'm going to show you a map in a second. Ultimately, from Bayonne, they settle in Amsterdam, which becomes the hub of the Portuguese Jewish diaspora because of its academy, Eitz Chaim Academy, which is really geared towards educating conversos about rabbinic Judaism, the wealth of its yechidim, the wealth of its prominent members, and there's a real rabbinic leadership, including Ashkenazi leadership from Italy, like Shaul Levi Martiera, who is Ashkenazi and doesn't really have a lot of empathy for the converso experience. And you also have rabbis that were conversos themselves that have been trained in Eitz Chaim Academy, which really did help the process of transition, like Yitzhak Abu Abdei Fonseca or Menashe ben Israel, others. And then over the course of the 17th century, you begin to have other satellites of the Portuguese diaspora, with really Amsterdam at its center, and Hamburg, and in Livorno, where Jews are given almost, I'll show you a map in a second, I promise, but in Livorno, where Jews are given almost complete autonomy, that's in the Tyrrhenian side of Italy. And then in the New World, starting in Brazil, when Jews began to settle in the Dutch part of Brazil after 1630. I'll return back to that in just one second. So this is what we think of as being the Portuguese diaspora. What makes it so unique is, first of all, they don't call themselves Sephardim. They call themselves gente de linaje, or de gente de nação. They call themselves people of the nation, or people of lineage. They assert their ethnic identity as being Portuguese. They never speak Ladino. It doesn't exist in the Western diaspora. It only exists in the Ottoman Empire. All their minutes are kept in Portuguese. Their sermons are in Portuguese. They speak Portuguese. And they're very different than the Sephardim of the Ottoman world, because they had all had this experience of being Catholics. And on top of that, there is the re-Judaization process is often very difficult, because think about being a converso. You don't know what rabbinic Judaism looks like. Maybe you had access to the Bible, but as you all know, biblical Judaism is extremely different than rabbinic Judaism of the Talmud. So they needed new types of literature to explain to them what Jews do. A lot of conversos reject that. Famously, like Spinoza or Uriel de Costa, become heretics. Or you also have those that double down and become like extremely, you could say very almost fundamentalists, like Robio de Castro, who starts like being a kind of rabbinic, sort of a rabbinic source of authority. These are all the various aspects of regionalization. This is all really important to understand Jamaica, because this is the community of Jews that inhabit Jamaica and what they're going through, their process of building an identity as being Jewish. I made this morning, and I was like, okay, I need a map of the Portuguese diaspora. So I took off the Google Maps and I made some lines, and here's Jamaica here. But I just wanted to quickly just show you some of the migrations here. Here is, let's say, Lisbon, from Lisbon into southern France, where there's this process of re-Judaization. From there off into Livorno, where Jews have almost complete autonomy and are invited to live by the Medici as Portuguese Jews. London in 1655, here's Amsterdam, here's Hamburg. These are the main communities of the Portuguese diaspora. And then Brazil, Jews were expelled from Brazil. There was a huge community of Jews in Recife in Pernambuco in between 1630 and 1654. And when the Portuguese conquered the northern province of Brazil, all those Jews had to leave. And they'll go to Suriname. Most will go back to Amsterdam. Some will go to Livorno. And from Suriname, from Brazil, you've got Jews that come to New York. From Barbados here, Jews come to Newport. And straight from England, Jews inhabit Savannah. And then the biggest community of the Caribbean, Curacao. Here, the island that was once connected to Venezuela. So it's not a volcanic island like most of the Lesser Antilles, but rather a continental break off from the continent. So it's a very different kind of environment. So here, I know this is a lot to digest, but this is kind of the general breakdown of what we mean by the Portuguese diaspora. Okay, so let's talk about Jamaica specifically. The very early city of Port Royal, which is what you're seeing here, it was a very the Spanish had inhabited Jamaica before the British. The British took it from the Spanish in 1655, and there were conversos living, Portuguese conversos living under the Spanish in Jamaica. We don't know very much about them, but because they're completely hidden. It's possible that some were crypto Jews. The problem is that there was an Inquisition in the Caribbean, the Inquisition that was in Colombia of Cartagena das Indias. And so they had, that Inquisition had control over the whole Caribbean. And as far as we know, there was nobody prosecuted for Judaizing from Jamaica, unlike Colombia, where there were a lot. There were 3 Inquisitions in the Americas that were very accelerated in their violence towards conversos. So Jamaica definitely had conversos, but we don't know much about them. And then 1655, the English come, and they offer privileges to live there as Jews. And so by the 1660s, 1670s, you have an established community, especially in Port Royal, which the British have turned into a major trading port. And that's because here you see Kingston Harbor, and Kingston, which is actually here, and Kingston Harbor is one of the very rare places in the Atlantic that could shelter a fleet all year round. That in New York Harbor, which meant that privateers in the Navy and the merchant fleets could all kind of stay around all year round, which made Port Royal a very profitable trading port. But it wasn't a very easy place to live because there was no source of potable water. It had to be ferried. It's obviously very susceptible to hurricane and earthquake, as we'll see. And it was, and all the food almost entirely had to be imported. So it was not a very easy place to live. But this started to have a pretty sizable Jewish community before 1692, when the city is destroyed by an earthquake. And just something about, so they come in waves. There's no one path of migration to Jamaica. They come in 1667 when Suriname is taken by the Dutch. Some of the Jews that are living there want to live within the British world, so they go to Jamaica or go to Barbados. In 1685, Jews were expelled from the French Caribbean, and so a lot of those Jews come to live in Jamaica. So there's kind of multiple paths of migration, and almost all the leadership were re-Judaized in Bayonne. So there's a very strong connection to southern France as well, which is an amazing thing because France is at war with the English after 1688. But the Portuguese diaspora sort of transcends these imperial borders. Jews living in Port Royal can purchase the right to be denizens, which gives them the right to arbitrate their disputes in court, own land, trade freely, but they, as a denizen, you have to pay very high tariffs, alien tariffs, and that status is not inherited by your children. So it doesn't exist in perpetuity. Now you could purchase for a very high cost a bill from the Parliament in England, a naturalization act from Parliament, which is a very time-consuming, very expensive process, and that will give you all those rights to trade, go to court, and it would also be inherited by your children. Now, despite that, even if you're naturalized, no Jews can serve in law, no Jews can vote in elections, the Jews can't have any kind of civic position. So there is severe disabilities that affect the Jews living in the British world. But in 1671, they're given the right to open worship. So they're allowed to live there openly as Jews. Now, this was par for the course in port cities around the world. You know, most port cities had some kind of tolerance for Jews to openly practice. But it was also, Port Royal was a place of a lot of ethnic and religious diversity. There were Catholics living there, and there were a lot of Protestant dissenters like Huguenots and Quakers and Mennonites and all kinds of people living in Port Royal. So Jews were one of many kind of religious and ethnic diversity groups that were living in Port Royal at the time. So also it wasn't a place of just kind of merchant community, because you also had some cultural figures. The Rabbi Josiah Pardo, who was the son of the great David Pardo in Amsterdam, one of the biggest rabbis in Amsterdam, had served in Curacao, and he came to Jamaica a year before he died. He was only in Jamaica for a year, but he probably had a lot of influence, and he brought like the Eitz Chaim trained rabbinic authority to the Caribbean. And also you have a former converso, Daniel Isar Lopez Laguna, who writes a Spanish translation of Psalms in a way that was acceptable to Jewish readers. So, you know, he writes a kind of Jewish version of Psalms in Spanish because nobody knows Hebrew in the Portuguese diaspora. They don't, they had no exposure to it. They read everything in Spanish and Portuguese. And he was writing this in Jamaica. So there was some kind of cultural productivity in Port Royal as well. Very early on, Jews began to ferry their dead across the harbor and to the Ligony Plain, which is modern-day Kingston, and there they would bury their dead in the cemetery called Hunts Bay Cemetery. And by 1730s, the Jews actually acquire a license to hold the land, but they had already been burying their dead there. So very similar to what was happening in Ouderkerk in Amsterdam. The dead Jews were being ferried to the cemeteries to be buried. And here you have a good picture I took of Hunts Bay Cemetery a long time ago. This is after it had been restored. I'm happy to talk more about like the modern contemporary situation in Jamaica. But just to give you a sense of what Port Royal was like, the oldest building that exists is actually a church. And but this was rebuilt in the exact model of the earlier version. So you get a good feeling for what Port Royal was like. Now, Port Royal, I have a chapter in my book called The Peril of Port Royal, which is, this is hardly a rosy story. And that is because, so Jews faced a lot of hostility in Jamaica. They were probably the most profitable mercantile group because of their vast networks of exchange that extended to conversos living in South America, or to Portuguese Jews living in Western Europe. Western European Portuguese Jews were connected to conversos living in Iberia or living in Antwerp, who were connected to Portuguese conversos and full Jews living in India, who were connected in Goa or in Cochin, who were connected to Portuguese networks in Java, in Indonesia. So this was part of a global exchange. And so this made Jews very profitable in Jamaica, which ignited the hostility of the non-Jewish merchants that were having a hard time competing. So you start to see various attempts to curtail Jewish trading activity in Port Royal before it was destroyed. And some of these petitions are deeply hostile to Jews. And the Jews would lobby against them, using their a community in London that was more established, but also still very nascent and small, not like Amsterdam. London was still also a satellite to Amsterdam. And then everything goes bad when Port Royal was destroyed by a major earthquake on June 7th, 1692, which resulted in a tsunami that destroyed the city. And most of the city is still to this day under the sea. There's a lot of underwater archaeology that takes place there. And there's some interesting accounts of Jewish, how this affected Jews, and of course it did. And there was even some letters written to the Ottoman Empire giving a death toll of the Jews to the Chachamim who were living in Salonika. So this had a resonance, and it certainly affected Jews. But the biggest effect really was that Jews sort of move across the harbor to Kingston into Spanish Town. And by 1704, you see the establishment of communities of Portuguese Jews living in Spanish Town and in Kingston. And it was the inauguration of a period of deep anti-Jewish hostility in Jamaica that was actualized in a Jewish tax, similar to what the jizya that Dhimma paid in the Islamic world. Jews had to pay a collective tax. This didn't exist in Western Europe. Jews in Amsterdam or London or France didn't pay collective Jew surtaxes, but they did in Jamaica for a long time. And this was also the product of a kind of a lobby campaign, transatlantic lobby campaign, to try to ameliorate this position and to try to improve the circumstances of Jews living in Jamaica. This came with some suspicions of the Jewish presence in Jamaica. So especially in the, I'll return to this map in a second, in the context of the First Maroon War, when former slaves, runaway slaves from the Spanish, so they'd already been there way before the British ever got there. These were autonomous Black communities living in the northeastern coast of Jamaica, and they were at war with the Jamaican militia in the 1730s. And then everything changed when those Maroons, as they're called, started to use gunpowder. And the militia wondered, where are they getting their gunpowder from? And under coerced testimony, one of these Maroon captives said that they were getting it from Jews in Kingston, which is possible, or maybe not possible. We don't know, but it was a claim that was very much believed. And so you see that the Jews had very little negotiating power in the backdrop of this claim that they were a fifth column and they were the ones providing gunpowder to the Maroons. Here in Kingston, I wanted to show you this map and I highlighted it for you. Here you see the Jewish quarter of the city. Here's where the synagogue is on Princess Street. It's right up the harbor, but really Jews are confined to just this place, this part of Kingston, the southwestern corners, which is also where free people of color live, who I'll talk about in a minute. So there's a deep connection there. Here you see the burying grounds of the burial grounds of people of color who are very much connected to this district of Kingston. Okay, so now we get into a period of the height of Jamaican prosperity. After 1740, the island of Jamaica had made a stark shift away from trading economy, a mercantilist economy, towards a plantation economy that was almost singularly focused on the production of sugarcane, which resulted in the enslavement of thousands and thousands of displaced people from Africa, Western Africa, and living on these plantations in this brutal slave system. By 1740, people of African descent were 95% of the population. They were very, compared to the white population, they were living in a slave society. They were living in a society that was a majority enslaved. And so this helped to produce a lot of prosperity for the English and those that held slaves. And so you see it reflected in the Jewish community in the 1760s. The Jewish community begins to build their synagogues again. They tear their synagogues down and rebuild them in these grand fashion with this marble, and they make it look really nice. Also, Jews are benefiting from this. They're given the right to have naturalization without an act of parliament and without a Christian oath in 1740, if they can pledge to stay there for 7 years. And Jews in Jamaica very much take advantage of this. So after 1740, there's this Jewish population boom. There was an attempt in 1750 for a Jew that had been naturalized in 1740, Abraham Sanchez Morao. He defiantly cast a vote in the elections of 1750, which caused a firestorm of anti-Jewish hostility. How dare he do that? Jews were explicitly forbidden from voting for the member of assembly in Jamaica. So in fact, the Jews in England put him in cherem for doing this. There's a letter, they expelled him and they censored him for doing this because their position was, don't rock the boat. Everything is good here. Don't cause attention to yourself. But he believed that being naturalized would also give him the right to vote, and he was wrong about that. And of course, Jews were slave owners like everybody else. And this is a very difficult reality. I know it's an uncomfortable reality to accept, that a Jew could be at a Passover Seder and saying that we were once slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt while being served by African slaves. But this happened. It happened a lot. It had a ramification in Jewish law and Jewish practice. And Jews were as brutal as everybody else. There's no reason to think that Jews had any other patterns of slave ownership than anybody else. There's been some mythology about this, that, oh, Jews were kinder slave owners, or they manumitted their slaves more often. They didn't. In fact, I crunched the numbers and wills and found that a slave was 12 times more likely to be inherited in a will than manumitted in a will, that is, freed in a will. And there's lots of cases of Jewish abuse and rape of the enslaved. That's the world that they lived in, and they were humans like everybody else. And that's and we have a moral obligation to accept this, to confront this reality, I think. Now, this also had some fascinating ramifications. You see very commonly Jewish men, married and single, are cohabiting with disenfranchised women of color. And this has a lot of interesting ramifications. So first of all, in Jewish law, that's fine. There's no reason in Jewish law that you couldn't. Even in some Italian context, there was rabbis and various responsa that had allowed the use of Black non-Jewish concubines. In the Ottoman Empire, it was very common for Jews to purchase slaves from the Black Sea region for sexual servitude, and this was common. And there's no reason by rabbinic law this would be forbidden. But Jews used Black slaves as surrogates. They used them in informal marriages. So you have a lot of these kind of monogamous long-term marriages or long-term cohabitation with women of color and single men. And this freed men of all the obligations of marriage and a lot of the benefits of marriage without having to also give them inheritance. So that's because you could marry a Black person in Jamaica. That was legal, unlike Louisiana or the United States. So this is a uncomfortable reality, but it also gives rise to a whole population of people that are descended from Jews, and you have a community of free people of color that are Jewish. And there's very flexible notions of what makes a Jew in the Caribbean in the 18th century. So that's a topic maybe for a different time. But it's just a reality that of Jews living in the Caribbean. In Suriname, it was much more extensive. And in Suriname, there's a lot more records about these kind of relationships and how Jews of color were brought into the community and what level, in what way. Okay, so here, I mean, just to kind of get a sense of the brutality of all this, right? There was major slave revolts. 1760, there was a major slave revolt in Jamaica called Tacky's Revolt, and Jews, of course, were targeted by people of color in the same way. So from a white perspective, Jews were kind of like people of color. They had all the same rights as free people of color. But from the perspective of the enslaved, there was no difference between a Jew and a white Christian. They were the same. They were both their owners. Okay. Now, I just want to quickly mention this. So Jamaica is not just a story of the Portuguese Jews. There were a lot of German, Yiddish-speaking Jews also living there from the very beginning. In fact, so in Port Royal, there was a Jew, Benjamin Franks, who's the uncle of the famous Jacob Franks of New York, one of the earliest Jews in the United States, North America, that is. He was a diamond trader, like the Portuguese were doing. And he was probably, I know there's a lot of discussion about Jewish pirates. He's the only Jew that ever had anything to do ever with pirates. And he was on a Jewish pirate ship called the Adventure Galley and testified against Captain Kidd at his trial in London in 1696. He left Jamaica after the earthquake. But that's just to say that there were Ashkenazim And again, Ashkenazi is a very problematic term, as is Sephardi. And there's big differences between Polish and German expressions of Jewry. And so Ashkenazi is a difficult term too. I just prefer to say German, Yiddish-speaking Jews. But they were there. They were a very small community, unlike in the Dutch Caribbean. So Curaçao, St. Eustatius, and in Suriname, you had major communities of Ashkenazim that had their own independent communities by the 1730s. But in Jamaica, they were very small, and only in this late 1780s and 1790s are there actual Ashkenazi communities. And one very interesting person, I'll just say this: there was in the west coast of the island, there was an enclave of Ashkenazim, all surrounding this one very wealthy man who had this huge estate and lots of concubines and children of color named Chaim Cohen, who lived there. And he was a fabulously wealthy person, and his estate was like a magnet for a lot of his kinship network and other Ashkenazim who resented Portuguese authority, and Portuguese resented Ashkenazim. There was no sense of Jewish solidarity at all. Portuguese had a very distinct ethnic identity, and Ashkenazim did not fit within that identity. And that was very clear in a lot of ways. So marrying an Ashkenazi was was grounds for excommunication in the Atlantic world. So it was a very scandalous thing to do for a lot of reasons, which I'm happy to talk about later on. But so Ashkenazim also resented Portuguese authority. So they moved to Black River, a slaving port in southern part of Jamaica, where they participated. They had their own little Ashkenazi enclave. One very cool Ashkenazi who ended up in Jamaica was Michael Leone, who was a Mayor Leone, a German-speaking Ashkenazi Jew who grew up in London. And he became a very famous opera singer in the 18th century, and he was a Chazan in the Ashkenazi community of London. And he got in trouble in London for singing Christian music, and so he had to probably leave England, and he comes to Jamaica, where he becomes the Chazan in the Portuguese synagogue. So that tells you a lot about like the blending too of these two communities. And he also sings in the Duena, which is an English language opera that was being performed in the 1780s in Spanish Town. So he was probably one of the most famous Jews around. Okay, now the late 18th century. I have like about 5 minutes. I'm going to talk and then I'll sum up here. But the late 18th century was kind of horrible for Jews. It was horrible for everybody living there because the American Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, hurricanes in the 1780s, all of these things put together, culminating in the Napoleonic Wars, led to a really dramatic, and then the end of the slave trade dramatically affected the wealth and position of Jamaica in the Western Hemisphere. And this affected Jews and everybody else living in Jamaica. But Jews had very strong rabbinic leadership in the late 18th century. Joshua Hezekiah de Cordova, someone I've written about a lot, was an Eitz-Chaim trained rabbi who served the community for 40 years. So they had very sustained rabbinic leadership. There were no rabbis in North America, but the Caribbean had a lot of them. I'll skip the French stuff, but I just want to say, when Jews were emancipated in 1831 and given the right to vote, 6 months after free people of color are given the right to vote, they were coming off of a time when it looked like everything was going backwards. The late 18th century was a terrible time for Jews. And this, I'll give you some examples. And if you read the Jamaican press from the late 18th century, it's full of caricatures and hostile anti-Semitic ethnographies and things like that. But also there were some incidents. So in 1783, a mob threatened to burn down the synagogue on Kol Nidre, the night of Yom Kippur, and they were disbanded, but the threat was there. That had happened earlier in Barbados at Speightstown. In 1739, a synagogue had been torn down. So those Jews knew about that, and that was a very scary event. And also this one interesting case is Joshua Montefiore, who was the uncle, the adventurer uncle of Moses Montefiore, who you might know about, came to Jamaica to practice law, which was perfectly legal in England. And he was opposed by 60 attorneys that brought a case. I found this court case and I've written about it, and it's and there's a lot of fascinating elements there that all show that Jews in Jamaica were actually in some ways much more disadvantaged than they were in England. So it's not a story of like it's not a completely rosy story for Jews. And I'll just mention this, Isaac Mendes Belisario, who was the Portuguese Jew who is like he made lithographs in the early 19th century. And he's considered the kind of artist, the national artist of Jamaica. He made an effort to really try to capture the culture of Creole people of color living in Jamaica and what that looked like. So he made these sketches of character, which is an inherently racist like motif. That is true. And he was celebrating Black culture, but in a way that was also caricaturing it. So it's hard to understand him, where he really, his position but he was a champion of emancipation. And he painted these very famous images that were very important in helping people of color sort of understand their own Creole identities later on as Jamaica moves towards independence. Here are some, I just want to mention this briefly. Alexander Lindo was a major slave trader, a Jew from Bordeaux. Here you see a sale by Alexander Lindo, the French Jew. He was one of the biggest slave traders in the Caribbean. And I want to show you this because the almanac from 1796 in Jamaica has a Hebrew calendar in it. Some of the Hebrew is a little bit funny, but here you see Rosh Chodesh Av is on this day, and Tisha B'Av is this day, and Rosh Chodesh Elul. So Hanukkah is coming up here, and here we go, Rosh Chodesh Kislev, Hanukkah here. So, you know, this shows you that Jews were present in the general community. Here are some more sketches of character, just to get a flavor of what Belisario is all about. Another Belisario portraying a Jew, a Jewish clergyman. And here you see the synagogue, the modern synagogue of Jamaica, built in 1912, inside and outside. And that's 40 minutes. So we could all take a breath. I know I just crammed a lot of information down your throats, and I'm sorry for that, but I wanted to see if I could cover a kind of a big, long durée. And I'm happy to have a discussion and clarify anything. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for this very, I'd say very in-depth, even though you say this is just a cursory part of the in-depth of your research on this. I did put into the chat for those of you who are looking to read more about the book and purchase it, as well as the 25% off code that you can use on that purchase. But before we move into purchasing the book, if anyone has any questions for Professor Mirvis, I know that he mentioned a number of things they said we can talk about further, even modern day Judaism in Jamaica as well. So please feel free to either unmute your mic or use the chat, whatever you're most comfortable with. Stan or Betty, I'm not sure who has the question.
Okay, well, we in our movie group, we saw the movie Sephardic, which is about the Portuguese Jews and their this one guy's attempt to reach out to people who were conversos and bring them back to Judaism. So that's exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, this continues to happen today, especially in New Mexico and in Baja in northern Mexico. There's a lot of people who claim to have converso ancestry. Now, a lot of these claims are a little bit funny for a lot of different reasons, but there is good reason to think that, especially in western Texas and northern Mexico, there were a lot of conversos, and that was because even though conversos were forbidden from migrating to the Spanish Americas, they found ways of getting there, as we know, because like the Mexican and the Lima and the Cartagena Inquisitions were very much involved in killing and in in interrogating conversos. But if you were a conquistador, you could live there with a land grant. So Luis de Carvajal had a major land grant in New Leon, which is modern day Texas and Mexico. And so a lot of conversos came and that were legitimately, he was a sincere Catholic, but there were a lot of crypto Jews that also came in his family. So yeah, a lot of it's connected to that. Some of these claims are very funny though.
Question. The Jamaican population, the Haitian population today are predominantly black. Are they all basically from slavery, or were there any native people who were people of color but not black, or what? You know, what was the population?
Good question. That's a great question. There were indigenous inhabitants of the Caribbean. They're known as Taino, they're known as Carib, they're known as Arawak. So there were a number of different ethnic groups that inhabited Hispaniola, which is Haiti and Dominican Republic, and Jamaica and Cuba, like the big islands, the Greater Antilles. And they were eradicated. They died of pathogens extremely early on in the Spanish, in their encounter with the Spanish. And so there was just no immunities, and you had the most accelerated death of people in the between 1520 and 1600. We're talking about the rapid deaths of millions and millions of people in the Americas. So the indigenous population of the Caribbean did not do very well in that, and so the answer really is no. Yes, there were indigenous people in the Americas, but in the Caribbean, but the people that are the modern people of Haiti, Jamaica, and or descended from slaves that were brought against their will.
Any other, okay. What is the current number of Jews in Jamaica? Are they both of Portuguese and Ashkenazi descent? That is
good question. So right now the estimate is about 200. That's probably a pretty generous estimate. And there's very few Portuguese left. There's an old guard of Portuguese Jews who are still there and have a kind of privileged place in the synagogue in Kingston. But Portuguese Jews in general are kind of endangered. There aren't very many people with a Portuguese Jewish identity today. They don't, unlike Sephardi did very well in the Ottoman Empire. Like Ladino is still spoken by lots of Jews today. If you're from Istanbul, you probably speak Spanish, Ladino. But Portuguese is not very much spoken in the Jewish world today. So there are very few Portuguese old guard, I would say. And then there were different waves of migration. So in the late 19th century and early 20th century, you had lots and lots of Jews that were leaving the Ottoman Empire, and Christians, so Mennonite Christians and Jews were fleeing from Lebanon under the Ottoman Empire as the Ottoman Empire was crumbling. And a lot of those Jews come to the Americas, Argentina. So now you actually have Sephardi Jews who are living in the Caribbean. And so they have conflicts with the Portuguese. But people like Haddad and Matalan, kind of the big names today, are from that migration. And then during World War II, in the lead up to World War II, you have a lot more Viennese and German migration into the Caribbean. So today you have mostly, I would say, the Sephardi from the Ottoman world. You have a lot of descendants from Ashkenazim that came in the 20th century, and also a lot of Israelis. So a lot of Israelis have some business dealings going on in, especially in Kingston. So there's a lot of Israelis that are members of the community today, and a lot of Black Jamaicans who are part of the community either because they have a heritage of having been descended from a Jew, or because they have an otherwise attachment, some kind of attachment to the Jewish community. But they make up a large part of the community in Kingston.
Any, first of all, I'm it's fascinating. You know, it's truly. So when did this sort of, because you say there's so few people that are left, and even of those who can really sort of be the originals or descendants of the originals, did they just disappear because of commerce and because of opportunity?
Well, yeah, the Portuguese communities in general kind of disappear for a lot of reasons. There just tends to be, it's kind of a funny thing because if they come from Catholicism and then they become Jewish. So they have like what my teacher, Joseph Kaplan, the great scholar of Western Sephardic Diaspora, Hebrew University, he called this an alternative path to modernity. So we think of Ashkenazi, like the Ashkenazi path to modernity is like they proverbially left the ghetto and they became, they eschewed their kind of traditional world and then adopted the secular world. But for the Portuguese, it's a little opposite. It's opposite because they came from having been Catholics to adopting rabbinic Judaism. So they were kind of moving in the opposite direction. But then in the 19th century, very few Portuguese Jews continue to identify as Jewish for a variety of reasons. But in Jamaica specifically, there was a lot of reasons why people started to leave. In the 1920s was very difficult. There have been major earthquakes. There have been racial unrest. And so in the early 20th century, a lot of the Jews start going to Panama. So Panama becomes a major Jewish community in Cologne that was connected, that was sort of the remnants of Jamaican Jewry. And then in the night after independence, then things got very bad. So after independence of Jamaica in 1962, there was politicized violence in the island. And then that sort of culminated in the 1990s and the drug trade from South America. And then today there's a lot of violence in Jamaica, but it's not political or really drug related. It's all just poverty related. It's sort of like entrenched in the deep poverty of the island. So yeah, and the lack of education opportunities and the rising violence all kind of has contributed to the decline of the community over time.
I see a question here in the chat. Were these Jewish immigrants from Queen Isabella's reign? I know you mentioned that in your presentation, but.
Yeah, so I think you're referring to Isabella and Ferdinand. So those are the monarchs that unified the two biggest Christian kingdoms of Spain, Aragon and Castile in 1474. They inherited a lot of Muslims because they conquered Granada and they agreed to allow Muslims to live as Muslims in Spain, but they quickly backed away from that position. And the Muslims of Spain had an armed insurrection, the Alpujarras insurrection in 1499. And then when culminating in 1492, when these Catholic monarchs, as they're called, laid to waste Granada, the last holdout of Islam, of politically empowered Islam in Iberia, then they decreed the expulsion of the Jews. So this may have affected 200,000 people. I mean, it was a huge dislocation of people. And this was, so a lot of Jews convert, most Jews convert and stay. Some, and those that stay Jewish largely cross the border into Portugal and they pay a tax, 8 cruzados, and they're there welcomed by the Portuguese crown. Because the Portuguese crown wants Jews, but they don't want Judaism. So then Isabella and Ferdinand pressure the Portuguese king Emmanuel and Joao to then convert the Jews, which they don't want, or expel them. And they don't want to do that because they want Jews around, so they just convert them in mass rather. And they also give them a moratorium on inquisitorial investigations. So that's how crypto-Judaism really survives in Portugal, but not in Spain. Because in Spain, there have been an inquisition since, the 1480s. There have been a converso population since the 1390s. So there was Spain was a very different situation. But that's, I think, yes, that's how Portuguese Jews are connected to Spain. And sometimes vice versa, like the very famous rabbi, courtier rabbi on Isabel and Ferdinand's court, Don Yitzhak Abravanel. He was Portuguese. He wasn't a Spanish rabbi. He spoke Portuguese. So there's the two communities are sort of entangled in some fascinating ways. But why were Jews expelled from? That's the big question. Why were Jews expelled from Spain was, and there's a lot of debate about this, and of course there's economic factors and racial factors and all of that, but the decree of expulsion tells you why. And according to the decree of expulsion, it was because they believed that that conversos would never fully integrate into Iberian Catholic society as long as they're being influenced by Jews that are still living in the same neighborhoods. So the idea was to get rid of Jews, and then maybe these conversos could more seamlessly enter into the fabric of Catholic society. And that's the stated reason for why Jews were expelled by Isabella and Ferdinand.
Thank you. I had one question, but it might be the final. I want to make sure everyone else has questions answered if they have any. Any other questions for Professor Mirvis?
I have a question, but it's got nothing to do with the subject. It has to do with his first name. Stanley is a name. I'm a Stanley, and it's from my era, and you're a lot younger than I am, so that's why I wanted.
Yeah. I actually looked it up once, and it looked like, and I saw these graphs of when names become popular. And the name Stanley, I looked it up, was very popular. Like in 1916, it reached its peak. And then it has had a steady decline ever since. But I'm named after my grandfather, Stanley Mirvis, the original Stanley Mirvis.
Okay, because
Mirvis. Yeah.
Mine is from the 30s, and I was at a wedding, and I asked somebody how old he was. He got a little upset with me because he had the same first name, and we were about a year apart in age.
Yeah. Well, it's really, I inherited it from a much better person than I am. My grandfather, who was he lived in Atlanta, Georgia, and he was a major, obviously a member of the temple there, a very identified Jew, but he also was in the cutting edge of integration. And he defiantly had the very first integrated scout troop in the South, was his Jewish and Black kids that came together in his scout troop. So I have a lot of pride in the name Stanley Mirvis, and I hope I do it justice before I die.
We had a family here called the Long Ears, and Stanley passed to every male, and so there was one Stanley Longear the fourth.
Yeah,
that gets confusing after a while. That's like what the Portuguese Jews do. Portuguese don't have the same traditions as Ashkenazim, so Ashkenazim are very much indebted to like the Sefer Hasidim, a 12th century text that really defies a lot of what Ashkenazim do. So like you don't give the names of a relative that is alive in an Ashkenazi tradition. And that goes back to the Hasidic Ashkenaz of the 12th century. And but Portuguese Jews, they don't hold to that. So you have a lot of people who are the same name. And also they have multiple aliases because a lot of them continue to travel back to Portugal. They'll cross the border, like they'll cross the border into France, and they'll join a Jewish community. And then they still have business dealings and family living in Spain. So they go back. And they go to the Inquisition and say, look, I did this, I'm sorry, and there are Jews living over there, and denounce all of them. They do their business, and then they take their Spanish name, and then they go back and take their Jewish name. People were very flexible in their identities. There's a great book about this by David Graysboard, who is my counterpart at U of A.
It's like the prize fighter George Foreman, who named all of his sons George.
Right. But and also there's a prize fighter who was Portuguese in London in the 1790s. Daniel Mendoza was the best boxer, the champion boxer, pugilist of late 18th century London. He was a Portuguese Jew.
I love how you can tie every single time they bring up a Stanley point and bring it back to this Portuguese presentation. If not, I would have jumped in and brought up another question. All right, I'm not sure. Ethel, did you have a question?
Yes, I have a question. There is some people think that Christopher Columbus was actually a Jew. What is your take on that?
Yeah, this comes up all the time.
Because there was Hebrew and his diaries and things like that.
Yeah, so look, his diary does have Hebrew script in it. He uses some Hebrew dating. That's not unusual since a lot of the astronomical texts in the 15th century were inherited from Jewish science. So like Avram Zacuto, this is a good example, was a Spanish astronomer who was in the court of Isabella and Ferdinand. And when they expelled Jews, Avram Zacuto said, I'm going to say a Jew. And he goes to Portugal. And then the Portuguese take up all of his astronomy. Avram Crescus, another Jewish astronomer. So I suspect that his use of Hebrew in his dating sometimes reflects probably the Jewish astronomical treatises that everyone used. But that said, here's the thing: was Christopher Columbus Jewish? No. But was he shadowed in mystery? Yes. We don't really know a lot about his identity, and he kept it that way on purpose. But he was probably Genoese. Now, what we do know is he also had a lot of conversos in his employ. He couldn't take open Jews, but we do know, like people like Luis de Torres was a converso, and he might have very well been a crypto Jew. You can't assume that every converso is a crypto Jew. A lot of conversos will like eat as much pig as they can just to show how Catholic they are. So you can't assume Marianism like the Spanish did in a derogatory way. But so we don't know Luis de Torres and other conversos. That's the best of our knowledge. But Christopher Columbus is not Jewish. He's probably Genoese. And that said, it's a good. We have enough like skeletons in the closet. I think we could leave that one aside.
Final question, unless someone has something else. And this is, I'm going to tie into the question that's in the chat from Odette, which is about the Marranos. But you made a comment earlier that there are issues verifying or even proving their Jewish identities. And I think that really comes back to a degree with the Marrano movement, which I know you've already sort of touched. So if you don't mind just elaborating on that in the sense of what do you see? Because I see it just as a rabbi, of course, people come and say, okay, are they Jewish or not? And we're like, well, there's a very simple process of how you verify someone being a Jew. And if you can't bring the proof, unfortunately, they might be Jewish. But
you're referring to like a matrilineal descent.
Correct.
Right?
Correct.
Yeah, in rabbinic law, that is connected to the Book of Ezra, a biblical text. The Talmudic rabbis had a lot of reasons to make Judaism connected to matrilineal descent. So that was true for obviously Jews in the 18th century. Rabbinic Jews held to that idea, but so just going back to conversos, so they're really tricky because conversos, there was already a converso community in 1390. So 1391 was there were huge riots throughout Spain that were drummed up by anti-Jewish preaching and a lot of economic hostilities, and this was the largest kind of like tragedy to befall the Jews numerically to that point. So we're talking about 100,000 people probably killed in this riot. And then you got about another 100,000 that converted to Christianity. Now, these guys were obviously being coerced, but then there were also some really famous rabbis that converted, and they weren't being coerced. Like famously, the Shlomo Halevi, the rabbi of Burgos, converts and becomes Pablo de Santa Maria. And his student, Joshua Halorki, converts and he becomes Geronimo de Santa Fe, and he leads the charge against Jews. So you have, even in that first generation, some conversions. And then in 1414, there was a major disputation, and a lot of Jews begin to convert by conviction at that point. So you have a situation in Spain. So here's a situation in Spain between 1390 and 1492, when there are no more Jews. And that is living in the same courtyard. You've got people who, let's say I live in the same courtyard, and I'm an openly identifying Jew. And my sister, though, is a conversa, and she's a committed Catholic, committed to Catholicism. And then I have but her mother, our mother, right, is also a Catholic, but she's a hidden Jew. And she'll actually do things like in secret that are Jewish or inherited traditions. This is a very common situation because everyone's just living in the same courtyard. And then the Inquisition, here's the thing, the Inquisition isn't focused on Jews, it's focused on conversos. And the situation, a very common inquisitorial cases like this, a disgruntled domestic servant will go to the Inquisition and say, look, I saw this lady, her name is Catholic, Marina Gonzalez, and she was, and on Friday, she cleaned her linens. She cleaned her linens on Friday and not on Saturday, ahead of a seventh day Sabbath. And she, and when she prepared her chickens, she slaughtered them and dropped their blood and covered the blood in the way that Jews do. And so now this is tested. So you have a disgruntled labor. So already it's kind of heresy. And then the Inquisition is looking for crypto-Judaism. So you can't take what the Inquisition says at face value. There are a lot of people who are another common case is I'm invited to dinner and they serve me a bunch of pig, and you say, oh, I don't want to eat this pig, I don't feel good. And then the next thing you know, you end up in the Inquisition. They say you didn't eat the pig because you're a secret Jew, right? And so these are the kind of cases you can't take the Inquisition at face value over who was actually a crypto Jew. In one really extreme position, and I don't believe in this either, but in one really extreme position articulated by a Portuguese scholar, Anthony Saraiva, was that there was no crypto Judaism. This is all an invention of the Inquisition, and that's a good possibility. But also, you can't take rabbinic sources at face value too, because they had a lot of reasons also to distance themselves from conversos, so to try to prevent an Aguna crisis in North Africa. So that's another issue too. So you see in rabbinic discourse, Tzemach Duran and others living in North Africa, they begin to more and more call conversos Catholics, because if they are, then when you have women coming from Spain to North Africa, then they can just more easily abolish their marriages, and so they can continue to live life. So these are a lot of the issues that are involved. Now identity thing. So in the 16th century, if you were a converso, you couldn't have the best job on earth, be a university professor. You couldn't enter into the military officer corps. You couldn't have any kind of civic duty. So there was limpieza de sangre laws, that if you had Jewish ancestry, you were really marginalized from society. So this created this industry of false genealogy. People tried to show, look, I'm not a converso. My ancestor was an old Christian going way back, And so you've all these drummed up, and so the Portuguese communities in Amsterdam, the Jewish communities, they make their own genealogies, counter genealogies. They try to show, no, you're a Jew going all the way back. And so you've got a lot of fascinating genealogies and family trees that are made, all trying to either prove a Jewish ethnic heritage or disprove one, depending on what you're looking for. And so that makes a lot of this very difficult. And in terms of the modern cases, so yeah, there are a lot of legitimate cases of people who are descended from conversos. That's true. But you have to be a little bit skeptical of these cases, I think, because first of all, what's their motivation? A lot of the times people are kind of, I think, articulating kind of a converso heritage out of a sense of nationalism to try to show that, like, look, Jews were here before everyone, we're the real natives to America because, we predated the British and the French. We were here with the Spanish. And so I'm a little bit worried about that kind of like more linguistic in a way, kind of like identity. And that's a little bit problematic. And sometimes their stories are very funny. So in one case, there was a group, I think in New Mexico, that said that they came out and they said that they were conversos. And how do they know that they were descended from crypto-Jewish conversos? They knew that because they would spin dreidels, they would spin tops on Christmas. And here's the thing, spinning tops on Hanukkah is a 19th century German thing. So like, obviously they were looking at what modern Jews do and then sort of adopting that. So a lot of these claims are very suspicious. I was involved in some of these when Spain gave the right to return and to people with Sephardic heritage. The Portuguese were much more interested, but they needed like scholars to sort of like write letters on your behalf. And I was asked to do a lot of these. And I actually did, for some people that I didn't believe actually had converso heritage, but there were people that were trying to leave from, trying to leave from Venezuela during a major humanitarian crisis. And I thought it was the humanitarian thing to do to kind of give them my consent, because like, people had no electricity and were living in a place where there was a military coup, attempted military coup. So, I mean, I didn't think that there was high stakes in that, but actually the Spanish rabbin overturned them all. So they were very serious about it. Yeah. So yeah, this identity is a serious issue.
Maybe
I don't know if I
they,
answered your question, but
yeah, no, I actually like that a lot. Maybe the Spanish rabbi overturned it. Same thing, like you said, the rabbi who they all got upset when he voted. You know, you're ruining the status quo here.
yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, I understood why they did it because they wanted people with legitimate Sephardi heritage to have this right of return to Spain and Portugal, and people were applying by the thousands because they wanted to leave Venezuela, and I have to admit I was part of that because I thought, well, look, this is a way to get people out. It's safe, and they're like, oh, you know, older people and people who couldn't survive, and like I really thought that it was a good way out. But I understood why the Spanish rabbinate were very.
So you wrote a letter that would go to those rabbis, and then they would read the research. Got it.
Yeah, actually, yeah, they and also the Israeli ministries. When I got one of these cases, it was fascinating. It really tested my language skills because I would get like these huge dossiers, partly in Hebrew, partly in Spanish, partly in English, and you had to kind of wade through it. And look, if they had a name that was a Portuguese name, I would just say, look at all these different people in their lineage that could have, you know, had that same name. You know, so, but yeah, I wasn't convinced that they actually did have, between you and me, you know, and all the people on the Zoomosphere.
Right. Oh, that's interesting. Well, I guess that was part of their process.
Yeah, no, I completely understood where they're coming from. They had to have some standard, or everybody would have Sephardi heritage,
Right.
and I got that. But if they were very misinformed in some ways because some people were granted were deemed by the Israeli rabbinate to be legitimately to be eligible for citizenship in Israel that were also rejected by the Spanish rabbinate. So there were some things like that were happening, like that were obviously political for whatever reason. So that's over now. That door has shut. Yeah.
Well, this has been really fascinating, and I want to thank you for your time in this presentation and all your research. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for listening. I really appreciate it, and I hope we have opportunities to meet again.
Yes, in person. That would be nice.
This would.